It's me again, and I'm back, and I've still got my pal Pretzel with me. Hi, Pretzel. Hi. I'm back with another guitar review. Hopefully, this one will be a little bit shorter than my last one, and a little bit less controversial than the review of the Classic Vibe Jazzmaster that I uploaded a short while ago. But the format will be similar. I'll be starting at the top and heading down to the bottom of this Fender alternate reality Electric 12 in Olympic white. And we'll also talk about the gig bag. And I won't keep you in suspense. I really like this guitar. I think it looks great. It's a pleasure to play. It really does feel really nice to play. It sounds tremendous, and it seems to be quite well made. It does, however, have a few quirks, as you would expect with any 12 string, and I do want to talk about those and be honest about those, but otherwise, this is probably just going to be a lot of praise, pointing out a few qualities to expect if you're about to treat yourself to one of these. So first, a little bit of background. I don't want to get into what the alternate reality series was about. There's lots of other videos on YouTube that can explain that to you, but I just want to talk about this guitar specifically because it's a little bit different from some of the other alternate reality guitars, and it also gets to some of the peculiarities that it has that might be annoying or might be unexpected, and that I think it's worth pointing out. So, the Electric 12 is an old design of Fender's. It was introduced in 1965. Famously, Carl Wilson from the Beach Boys had a prototype of this guitar. It had the same giant hockey stick or bally stick headstock. And the body shape was the same, but the electronics were a little bit different on Carl's guitar. His had switches on the bass side that were a little bit more similar to a Mustang. The one that was eventually released and sold for a few years was never really successful. It had a rotary switch up here with 4 positions. This version, of course, only has the 3-way toggle switch like a Jazzmaster or like a Les Paul. But otherwise, the styling of the original Electric 12 was very similar to a Jazzmaster or a Jaguar. It had this chrome plate here that is similar to a Jaguar. It had these skirted knobs from a blackface amplifier. And that's something that you'll also see on some Jaguars, I think. I don't know. I can't be bothered to keep these things straight. The point that I want to emphasize, though, is that the alternate reality Electric 12, which is the first time that this guitar, I think, has been reissued by Fender, although there have been some copies by other companies, it's not a historic reissue of the original Electric 12. There are some serious differences. And I'll just sort of quickly run through them. The most obvious one is the change in the electronics. As I said, we don't have the 4-way rotary switch, which I think gave you neck, bridge, and I think the middle was in phase and out of phase, or I might be wrong about that. The other thing that they did is they changed the shape of the body a bit. So this bass side horn is quite a bit sharper than the original Electric 12 was. And to contrast that, the bottom part has been flattened out. It sits flat like a Stratocaster does, whereas the original was shaped pretty much exactly like a Jazzmaster. There was a bit more of an offset kind of hump on this side, on the treble side. So that's been flattened out, so it has the advantage that the alternate reality Electric 12 will actually sit straight in a guitar stand, which is not something that can be said for most Jazzmasters or Jaguars. There are some other things that are different too. They didn't bother to remake the bridge. They didn't bother to, that is to say, reissue the old bridge. This is a ready-made Goto bridge from Japan. You'll likely see this on most 12 strings on the market these days, including the made-in-Japan Strat 12s and Tele 12s, and also on the Danelectro 12 strings that are quite popular. It's got a little surround around it to make it look more like an Electric 12 bridge, but it's actually the modern Goto bridge. The pickups have the same look as the old Electric 12 pickups, and also the pickups that you'll find on a Maverick, if you find one of those, or a Fender Custom. Not the new Parallel Universe Maverick, which is altogether different and has Gretsch-style pickups. That doesn't matter. You guys don't care. The point is that these pickups, while they look like two things. Number one, they look like old Electric 12 pickups. Number two, they look like P-bass pickups. But they really are neither of those things. Unlike P-bass pickups, they're not humbuckers. The two halves are not reverse wound, reverse polarity, so they're not humbuckers in that respect. That means that you will get a little bit of noise in either the neck or the bridge position. They are reverse wound, reverse polarity with one another, so the middle position is hum canceling. They also just sound really different from old Fender Electric 12 pickups, which is, I think most people will agree, a good thing. They sound terrific. We'll get to that in a minute. Let's start up, though, with the headstock, and then we'll work our way down to back to the bridge. It's a beautiful headstock. I really dig it. I think it looks really cool. Generally speaking, quite functional. The one criticism that I have, and you'll notice I've got some of these strings running through in the wrong way. That's just me being an idiot. I apologize for that. I'm sure the next time that I spend an entire day trying to string this up, I'll do a better job of it. That being said, whether you've got the strings run through the correct way or not, I did it right on the bass side, not so much on the treble side. I do find that these G strings, both of them, but especially the low G string, they're so far from the bridge that I find it can be a little bit hard to keep them in tune. And they're also at a quite sharp angle. Of course, the way I've done it makes it even worse, but they're at quite a sharp angle from the nut, which means you do get some pinging on those. You do lose some of the advantages of the Fender 6-on-a-side style of stringing. But it's really no fault of the tuners, which seem to me to be perfectly adequate. They move nicely, they hold tune pretty well. And as I've probably mentioned before, I like the slotted tuners. I like this style. They serve my needs. They lock the string down pretty well. I did find I had some trouble getting this guitar strung up, more difficulty than usual. Part of it is the fact that the little hump in the headstock, it makes it so that you can't use a string winder on the high G string. So it gets it to be a little bit harder to lock that string in, and yeah, that's just part of the deal with an Electric 12. But otherwise, again, in terms of function, it works just fine. Oh, and I guess I'll show you the back of the headstock. You can see here that this one is made in Mexico. It's a 2019 model, and the tuners don't have anything written on the back of them. So once we've moved down from the headstock towards the nut, it's a so-called synthetic bone. That is to say, it's plastic, and perfectly adequate for the purpose. It came from the factory, nicely lubricated with graphite paste, and it does the job. I have no issues with it. The main difference with bone, I find, is that you can it feels a little bit different under your thumbnail than real bone nut would, but otherwise it functions perfectly well. As we move down from that, we get to the part of this guitar where I think one of the two places where it really shines. My two favorite aspects of this guitar are the neck and the pickups, the sound. We'll start with the neck. In terms of dimensions, if you are new to 12 strings, you will, or if your experience with 12 strings has been limited to, say, Rickenbackers, or Rickenbacker copies, you might be surprised at how wide this neck is. It has a really wide nut width. I don't have the numbers handy, but I have measured it, compared it to my other guitars. It's got some width to it. And an aspect of this guitar's dimensions that I don't think any of the reviews have really communicated is the fact that it's got some bulk, I think, to the neck. And we'll sort of come around this way. It's not all that deep a neck. It does, however, have more depth than you'd expect if all of your experience with guitar playing is with more modern style guitars. For instance, if you've played Fender Player Series guitars or Squier guitars that have the modern C-shaped neck, this is a little bit deeper than that, and it's a little bit flatter, I find, right at the base of the C. This is also called a modern C-shaped neck, but to me, I find that it sort of bottoms out a bit with some flatness. But there's some bulk getting there. That being said, it's really pleasurable in the hand. It has this lovely satin finish on it, probably a urethane of some sort, but it feels really smooth. The carve is really nice. I think my fingers are of sort of middling size and shape. They're not too long, they're not too stubby, they're not too thin, they're not too thick, they're just right. And consequently, I find that I have a pretty easy time getting around on this fingerboard, up and down the board. And that's facilitated by both how wide the board is, again, much wider than a typical 6-string, not quite as wide as a typical acoustic 12-string, but still pretty wide, and the satin neck finish really facilitates moving around very quickly. So that's an aspect of this guitar that I'm really fond of. Also, while we're talking about size, I think I should back up and just talk about the weight of the guitar. In some ways, it's a monster. I've weighed it, it's around 10 pounds, so it is heavy. It's got some mass to it, and there shouldn't really be any surprises there, considering the Jazzmaster body shape is quite big compared to a Stratocaster, and this one isn't routed out for any kind of vibrato or anything like that, so it's just a big chunk of wood in the body, and you got the big chunk of wood on the headstock, and you got that quite substantial neck. That means it balances very well, and it's not so heavy that I find it's hard on the shoulders. But it's got some mass to it. I also want to talk about the fretwork, which is generally pretty close to excellent. I haven't had it that long, but we did move from early spring to now the heart of summer, and I haven't experienced any fret sprout through the lacquer along this Fretboard board. The ends of the frets are quite nicely dressed, actually. Generally, quite a nice feeling to play. And that goes for both sides, actually. Down here at the neck joint, you can see that the neck is not all that deep. It has a pretty unobstructed neck joint, I find. I don't have any trouble getting to the highest frets on this guitar, and that's just the nature of the Jazzmaster design. It's got this sort of flattened out treble side horn, which really does prevent the sort of impeded access that you get on some Strats. So if you're playing super high on the treble strings, which you can do on this guitar because the treble strings do intonate pretty well, you won't run into any problems. We have a Fretwork fingerboard, and in my review of the Squier Classic 5 Jazzmaster, I referred to Fretwork as having a kind of nubbly feel, and this is not one of the most attractive specimens of Fretwork that I've encountered. Fretwork typically has these parallel dark streaks running up and down the board, and that's pretty cool. This is not an exception. One thing I don't particularly like is here above the first fret, or before the first fret, there's a transverse streak that kind of looks like a water stain because it's quite pale before the streak. It's not a water stain, that's just how this piece of wood looks, but that's okay, it's not a big deal. So I've spoken of this board as being typical of Pau-Ferro, typical nubbliness of Pau-Ferro. What I mean by that is that it's a bit dry. It feels a bit dry to the touch. That being said, it's very hard. It's a lot harder than Laurel. It's a bit harder than Rosewood. And it has a very tight grain, which is sort of similar to ebony. So it's sort of like, if you can imagine a very dry ebony. Ebony is a very oily wood. Pau-Ferro, or at least the Pau-Ferro that Fender has been using, tends to be not oily. It tends to be very dry. This could probably do with some conditioning, which I haven't done yet. There's a lot of things that I haven't done with this guitar, and that includes, for instance, I haven't taken the cellophane off of this completely bare neck plate, and I also haven't taken the cellophane off of the pickguard, so that's what this sort of funky bit of bubbling is. There's nothing wrong with the pickguard itself. The other thing I'll say is, while we're talking about the visual impact of the board, the neck itself, it has some nice figuring to it. I don't know if you'd call it figuring, but it's got this very attractive grain pattern to it. It's just a nice chunk of timber. So we move into the body, and we've been talking about playability and intonation, and so I want to we'll get to the pickups in a moment, but I want to focus on this Gotoh bridge. Make sure that's in focus there. As you can see, if you're not familiar with this type of bridge from the popular Dan Electro 12 strings or other guitars of that nature, they do give you the ability to individually intonate the strings, as well as to adjust the height of each saddle and the tilt of each saddle. Each pair, rather. You can't individually adjust the height and tilt of each string, but you can adjust the intonation of each string and the tilt of each pair of strings. The way it works is the lower strings go through the body to these ferrules, and they're sort of in a wacky kind of configuration. This is the spec that Gotoh gives to guitar manufacturers. If you're going to install this, it does have to be like this. I'm not sure why, because the intonation happens in the saddle itself. But anyway, there must be a reason. As I said, I'm not a tech expert. Maybe somebody in the comments will tell me what the reason is. But the one complaint that I'll say, maybe the most serious complaint about this guitar, pretty much all 12 strings are going to have some minor intonation issues, and this one is no exception. Actually, generally I find the top 5 saddles were quite easy to get dialed in. The E string does present some problems. I'm using 10 gauge strings here, which are the strings that this guitar comes from the factory preloaded with. I've got a new set of D'Addarios on. D'Addario also makes Fender strings, so it's probably a pretty much identical set to the one that they have. But I do find that there isn't enough room on the low E string to get the bass string properly tuned in. It's still sharp at the 12th fret compared to the harmonic, and that's an issue. And I've tried to deal with it by dropping the saddle a bit, adjusting the cant of the saddle, and that's pretty much got me settled to the point where I can play that low E string all the way up the fretboard, although it does get further and further out the further past, like the 12th fret that you go. Whether this is a problem for you, I don't know. I like to be able to, play in any position. That's just what I'm accustomed to. 12 strings, though, are really designed to just bash out those cowboy chords in these lower positions, and if you're going to play solos, you're playing them on the treble strings. So probably relatively few people are going to be playing lead on the bass strings on a 12 string. But if you want to, you should be aware that you might have to maybe pull that spring out from that saddle or make some other kind of change that I haven't done yet. Otherwise, the intonation is pretty straightforward. The low strings in the courses, they adjust the same way that a Strat does with an imperial style screwdriver, I guess a precision screwdriver, Phillips head. Down here, the octave strings, the drone strings, they're adjusted kind of like a Floyd Rose would be intonated, where you unlock the saddle and then you slide it with your thumbnail up and down. And again, I find that works pretty well, and it enables one to get dialed in pretty well. And it so happens that although the E strings, the low E strings, sometimes give me trouble in terms of intonation, they never give me trouble in terms of tuning. In contrast to the G strings, which never give me trouble in terms of intonation, but they do sometimes give me trouble in terms of tuning. Oh well, can't have everything, can you? But these are really minor nitpicking complaints. Another little frustration is the truss rod adjustment, which, as you know, as you might have realized, is at the base of the neck, just like the old Electric 12s. I don't know why they did that. They made all these modernizing design changes to the guitar. I don't know why they didn't move the truss rod adjustment up to where you would expect to find it on a modern guitar. That's certainly where I'd prefer it. Taking the neck off is such a pain. But if you want to make a truss rod adjustment, say if you want to go to a lighter gauge of string or a heavier gauge of string, you will have to pop that neck off. I haven't done that yet myself. But yeah, generally I just feel that if they were going to make all these modernizing touches to the guitars, including the pickups, which I'm about to get to, that they might have done that one little bit of modernizing that most of their fans wouldn't have objected to, I think. So let's talk about the sounds that you can get out of this instrument. We've got these two split coil pickups, as I mentioned, off the top. I'll repeat that these are not humbuckers. Unlike the two split pieces of a P-bass pickup, they're not reverse wound, reverse polarity with one another. They essentially function as just one Strat style pickup, for instance, although that's not quite what they sound like. What this means is that in the neck position or in the bridge position, by the way, we've got a quite solid feeling switchcraft switch there, or at least I think it's a switchcraft. But in either of those positions, you are going to get some noise depending on the amount of interference that you've got going in the place where you're playing. I do, however, find that this guitar is whisper quiet compared to, for instance, the Squier Jazzmaster in my previous video. Either in the neck position or the bridge position, there's very little noise unless you're playing with a lot of gain, which why would you do that with a 12 string? It being a 12 string, you're going to spend most of your time in the bridge, I think. If you're looking for that Byrds style sound, you'll get very, very close in the bridge pickup here. Vintage Electric 12s had a couple of problems. You know, the strings were too close together, so they would rattle against one another in the courses. But also the pickups were known to sound kind of weedy. This is not the case with this guitar. The bridge pickup is voiced a lot more like a Rickenbacker bridge pickup, and consequently it has that, I hesitate to use the cliche, but it does have that very intense, jangly, all frequencies attack that most people, I think, want in a 12 string. You're going to get the Byrds sound in the bridge. tip, by the way. If you're looking for a Byrdsy kind of sound, a lot of people on the internet are going to overstate the importance of certain pieces of gear, be it certain types of amplification or certain types of compression. And I don't want to diminish the value of a good compressor, but there's more to it than that. It's mainly technique. And to demonstrate that, I'll just say I'm going straight into the amp. I'm not using a pedal. This is straight into my Fender Champion 20, and just demonstrating the importance of a thumb pick. This is a $1 investment, and it'll get you amazingly close to the Byrds sound. Oh, and turn your amp up pretty high enough to knock your camera over. By the way, if you're curious about my amp settings just then, here they are. And I've been thinking about doing a review of the Fender Champion 20, so let me know in the comments if that's something that you'd like to see or not. I mean, if it's not something you want to see, you don't have to say anything. That being said, let's not overlook the neck pickup, which has, I found, a sort of an acoustic sound, a very articulate sound. It's actually my favorite position to play in on this guitar. That neck pickup sound is really very musical. As I said, you can get an almost acoustic sound out of it. In the middle position, of course, you'll get a nice surfy kind of tone quality. Again, typical of the sound that Carl Wilson used to get out of his 12 strings in the Beach Boys. And because the pickups are reverse wound, reverse polarity relative to one another, that middle position is indeed hum canceling, which I don't think it was on the old Electric 12s, although I may be mistaken about that. All this is to say, you'll get a lot of cool tones out of this guitar. I have actually, as you can see in one of my other videos, just before I put this new set of strings on, I stripped off the drone strings and just played it as a 6-string. And my experience of that was, it's a very pleasant play, but the pickups themselves, I find, sound pretty comparable to a Jazzmaster pickup. They're a little bit richer than, say, a Strat pickup or a Jaguar pickup. The middle position is very similar to the Jazzmaster middle position. And the other positions too. So basically the core difference between the sound that you get out of these pickups and the sound that you'll get out of a good set of Jazzmaster pickups is that these are quite a bit quieter. So took a long time, but we got to a version of the Electric 12 pickups that I think are a real credit to the beauty of this guitar. These knobs, they feel a little bit cheaper than knobs on a Fender amp, but they're okay, they're functional. The pots are just fine. You can get that Velvet Underground third album sound just by dialing back the tone and leaving the volume up high. I do find that if you turn the volume down a little bit with the tone knob down, you'll really drastically reduce your signal. So I don't know if that's a characteristic of the types of capacitors and pots that they're using, but it's something to be aware of, that you get a real signal cut if you try to turn down both knobs simultaneously. This is the only guitar that I've got, though, where I do a lot of playing with everything up on 10, as you must. If only it went to 11. Overall, though, again, not a ton to say here. It's a really satisfying guitar to play. I enjoy it a lot. It sounds great, as you've probably heard from the clips. Apologies for my playing, but hopefully you get a sense of what the guitar sounds like, as with most of my demos played through a Champion 20 practice amp. So I do recommend this guitar if you are in the market for a 12 string, and this is the appropriate price range for you. As a last word, I'll talk briefly about the gig bag, the so-called Fender Deluxe gig bag. Yeah, it's a gig bag. It's more or less junk. It's very similar to the gig bags that you get for cheap on Amazon, and it really doesn't fit the guitar that well. Here, I'll see if I can do this one-handed. Is this gonna go in? Here's the guitar going into the bag. There you go. You notice that there's a ton of empty space up at the top of the bag here, and it rattles around a lot. It's because this is a bass bag. They didn't bother making a new bag for the Fender Electric XII, and why would they? They haven't made a case for it since 1965, and yeah, why would they bother going to that trouble for one of their guitars that's just barely sub $1,000. Anyway, it's kind of annoying because there's no other kind of case that you can use for it that I know of. There's certainly no hard shell case available for it. It would have been nice if there was some way to keep this guitar protected from, you know, dangerous creatures. Yeah, dangerous creatures like Pretzel. Yeah. Anyway, guys, that's the Fender Electric XII. Thanks for paying attention for however long it's been. Thank you, as always, for your traffic, and please drop some comments if you have any questions or anything of that nature. Thanks again.